On August 21st, 1961, a portrait was stolen from London's National Gallery. The portrait had only been on display for 19 days before it was stolen, and authorities would search for the painting for years while receiving a series of ransom notes. The theft would eventually lead to a significant change in British law, and so affected the national psyche that it was made a minor plot element in a James Bond movie. The theft of Francisco Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington deserves to be remembered. Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, is considered by some historians to be one of the most brilliant military commanders of all time. He never lost a battle in his 32 years of service to the British Crown. Some of his most notable achievements took place during the Peninsula War, a conflict between Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire and the Spanish Crown. Wellington would go on to defeat Bonaparte at the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Wellington's portrait, painted from 1812 to 1814 by the legendary Spanish court painter Francisco Goya, was commissioned by the Spanish Crown because of Wellington's service in the Peninsular War, including helping to free the city of Madrid. Goya, the artist who created the stunning masterwork, was a tempestuous creator whose later works would be marked by darkness, disturbing themes, and what some art historians have called madness. By 1812, Goya was deaf, having lost his hearing to an illness. Some say he threatened Wellington with a pistol to get him to sit for the portrait, but there's no historical evidence to support that story. Comparing Goya's portrait of Wellington to other depictions of the general, his Wellington is drawn in the light, with red highlights popping in his hair. It is a curiously colorful portrait, especially when compared to Goya's other, later works. On his uniform, Wellington carries the Order of the Golden Fleece, an honor bestowed by the Spanish. His eyes are drawn large and seem sad, even though the painting was done after what some historians consider one of his greatest victories. Wellington was known to have said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." Despite his many successes, he saw much of dead and sacrifice through his career. Perhaps that is what Goya attempted to capture in the portrait. Wellington gave the completed painting to his sister-in-law, who, in turn, gave it to her sister, Louisa, who was the wife of the 7th Duke of Leeds. The portrait remained the property of the family until 1961, when the 11th Duke of Leeds, John Osborne, put the artwork up for auction. The portrait was sold to an American art collector and oil tycoon named Charles Wrightsman for £140,000, but the British government was appalled that a master work of a British hero like Wellington would be sold to a foreign collector, and so they put a hold on the permit that would allow the painting to be shipped. Wrightsman, who disliked the sudden attention garnered by his purchase, offered to sell it to the British government for the cost he paid at auction, £140,000. There was a scramble, and between a foundation and additional government funds, the transaction was completed. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Goya's Wellington was to remain in England. The National Gallery in London set up a special display for the portrait to celebrate its acquisition. A special frame was constructed for it, and it was displayed all by itself, a decision which was probably lamented later. Until the theft of the Wellington, the National Gallery's biggest concerns had been defacement of the art, threat of fire, or war. Suffragettes had damaged paintings at various times in the gallery's history. Suffragette Mary Richardson slashed the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez with a meat cleaver as a political protest over the British government's arrest of Emmeline Pankhurst. On August 22nd, 1961, the portrait of Wellington was missing, but at first there was a delay in reporting because museum personnel assumed that the painting was away to be cleaned. As soon as it became clear, though, that the painting had been stolen, the British government jumped into action, searching nearby bus stations and train depots, trying to get the painting before it could be removed from the area. Through a few clues left at the scene, they deduced the thief climbed into the man's bathroom from a ladder placed in a courtyard that had been left open for renovations. The drop from the window to the courtyard was relatively steep, about 14 feet, and they believed only someone extremely physically fit would have been able to manage it, carrying an artwork with such a large frame. Although the frame had been constructed with emergency removal in case of fire in mind, it measured 33 by 28 inches and was built out of sturdy wood. Investigators also noted that the Wellington portrait went missing 50 years to the day after the theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre on August 21st, 1911. They began to develop theories that the heists were somehow connected, perhaps a copycat thief, or even, some opined, the same person, as a young man who was in his 20s in 1911 would have been in his 70s at the time that the Wellington was stolen, though the sheer physicality of the crime brought that theory into doubt. Though viewing the portrait was popular before its theft, even more thousands of visitors flocked to the display to see the empty spot where Wellington had sat after it was taken. Newspapers ran headlines full of shock and dismay. Phone calls and tips about the theft poured in from across the country. One tipster claimed he had sold the portrait and was going to sneak it out of the country on a plane. Another said he'd return the painting if a donation would be made to his favorite charity for nuclear disarmament. All were false trails, except one. A handwritten note with block letters was sent to the Reuters news organization that said, "Query not that I have the Goya," but went on to describe markings on the back of the painting that the National Gallery used to determine that the note must be authentic. The note went on to say, "This is an attempt to pick the pocket of those who love art more than charity," and said that the portrait would be held for a ransom of £140,000, the same amount that had been raised to keep the portrait in the country. The note further went on to demand that the thief be given a pardon or held harmless from prosecution for the crime. This motive perplexed the authorities. Generally, they told the press, crimes were committed for greed, not charity. But the fact that the thief referenced the exact amount paid by the government and foundation for the artwork pointed to the idea of a person outraged by government spending. Anonymous tips continued to pour in. Reuters received a phone call from a woman who claimed to be the author of the handwritten letter. She said if the ransom wasn't paid, she would steal a Renoir from the National Gallery in retaliation. In response, the National Gallery upped security around its Renoir collection, but nothing ever came of the threat. The National Gallery offered a £5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of the portrait. They said it was a crime that had caused the whole nation to suffer. Despite this reward offer, the investigation cooled until July the next year when another handwritten note, with a similar appearance to the previous ransom demand, arrived in the mailbox of the Exchange Telegraph. It said, "The Duke is safe, his temperature cared for, his future uncertain. We want pardon or the right to leave the country." The authorities didn't respond to this letter either. Meanwhile, in the cinematic world, when Dr. No, the first James Bond movie starring Sean Connery, was released in 1962, Connery's character James Bond spies the missing portrait in the lair of the titular character Dr. Julius No. It seems that the theft of the portrait had continued to capture the public's imagination. In December 1963, another note arrived, asking for money for release of the painting and a pardon for the crime. Again, authorities did nothing. Finally, on March 16, 1965, the author of the ransom notes wrote to suggest the painting be displayed and the funds raised in that manner. Again, the note was ignored. The authorities could not negotiate. However, 2 days after the final note arrived, the Daily Mirror newspaper published an article with the headline, "The Missing Goya in the Mirror, Our Sporting Offer to the Mystery Letter Writer." It suggested the art thief trust the Daily Mirror with the location of the painting, and the newspaper would do all that it could to get it displayed and money given to the charity of his choice. In response, the newspaper received a letter from the purported thief, asking if they could guarantee that they would raise at least £30,000. The newspaper published a letter in response, saying that they couldn't make any guarantees, but they would make a good faith attempt to work with the National Gallery to meet the demands. Finally, in May, the newspaper received a receipt for an item left at a Birmingham luggage station. Authorities raced to the spot and they recovered the Wellington, tightly wrapped and seemingly none the worse for its years-long adventure. It was only missing its specially constructed frame. Attendants at the station said the portrait had been dropped off by a young man who gave his name as Mr. Bloxam. The entire world wondered, was this the thief? The National Gallery refused to work with the Daily Mirror to raise money for the art thief's charity, but still the newspaper congratulated itself for succeeding where investigators had failed for years. Goya's Wellington was safely back in the National Gallery. Arthur Milton Estra recognized the ridiculousness of the situation in his book, The Art Stealers, when he wrote, "The man who had once asked £140,000 for the portrait had ended up paying 14 cents to get rid of it." The letter writer was incensed by what he saw as a violation of his good faith. He wrote 2 additional letters to the newspaper. One read, "We took the Goya in a sporting endeavor, and you, Mr. Editor, pinched it back by a broken promise. Furthermore, you have the effrontery to pat yourself on the back for your triumph. Animal, vegetable, or idiot." Everyone expected that to be the end of the affair. The thief could have easily disappeared into thin air, taking his crime with him to the grave. But in July, a man turned himself in to authorities, confessing that he had taken Goya's Wellington, accidentally confessed his crime to a drinking buddy, and wanted to turn himself in before the reward money was claimed. His name was Kimpton Bunton. He was 61 years old and lived in Newcastle upon Tyne. He said he stole the painting to raise money in order to pay television viewing licenses for seniors on fixed incomes who couldn't afford it. Button went through the details of the theft, saying he went in through the window, took the portrait in a van, stashed it in an apartment until the search died down, and then moved it north. The government charged him with theft of the portrait, theft of the frame, threats towards some of the gallery officials, and for depriving the public of the ability to enjoy the painting. Button's defense claimed that he was not guilty because he had stolen the painting with the intent to return it, reaching for a loophole in British law. The last portion of the Larceny Act of 1916 describes the crime of theft as being committed with the intent at the time of such taking permanently to deprive the owner thereof. Button said he intended to return the painting the entire time. His lawyer argued in court, "You may think the law stupid on this, but the law is the law. If someone goes into your house and takes your television set because he wants to watch a football match and then keeps it, it is extremely irritating and annoying, but it is not stealing." The court found Button only guilty of taking the frame, because unlike the painting, it was never returned. The judge sentenced Button to 3 months in prison, saying, "Motives, even if they are good, cannot justify theft, and creeping into public galleries in order to extract pictures of value so you can use them for your own purposes has got to be discouraged." Some suspected the judge also gave such a light sentence because he doubted that the elderly and overweight Button could have completed such a crime on his own without accomplices. Years later, there was a surprising twist that was revealed in some declassified government documents. It seems that Button's son John had eventually admitted to authorities that he was the one that stole the painting in support of his father's charity scheme. When authorities asked him why he hadn't come forward while his father was on trial, he said that he was merely respecting his father's wishes. It was John Button, who was young and spry, who had snuck into the National Gallery and stolen the painting, although his father had helped him to stash it and to write the letters. And then when the newspaper promised to raise the funds, he was the one who played the role of Mr. Bloxham, who had dropped the painting off at the drop-off point. John Button was never charged with any crime with relation to the theft of the Goya Wellington. Some historians have speculated that the pair probably concocted the scheme in order to get money and had come up with the story about the charity donation at the point that it made it clear that the government wasn't going to negotiate with them, because pundits on television had been talking about the very loophole that the pair eventually exploited in order to avoid most of the culpability for the crime. The 1968 Theft Act, a revision of the criminal law, addressed the theft of Goya's Wellington specifically with the addition of the words, "Removal of articles displayed or kept in churches, art galleries, museums, and other places open to the public." The government noted the need for the change, citing a striking recent instance in the removal from the National Gallery of Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington. In a way, the Duke of Wellington, who the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson described as one of England's greatest sons, continued to serve his country after his death because of the theft of his portrait that led to a modernization of the law that gave greater protection to important historical artifacts, religious relics, and works of art. Kempton Button died in 1976, but his charity wish was eventually fulfilled because in the 1990s, the British government started to give TV licenses free to seniors 75 years and older. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.